My interest in reproductive medicine goes right back to the time when the contraceptive pill was not a great success and was full of side effects, and I was commissioned by WHO with a very large grant to look at ways of trying to make better contraceptives which wouldn't involve the steroids and the hormones. And it's one of the many things that I've done in life and totally failed at doing. I got into in vitro fertilization quite early on, well, very early on, of course, when we tried to collect human eggs. In fact, actually, we were trying to collect human eggs at Hammersmith in the very early 70s, well before IVF was really going at all. And we were trying to put them back into the uterus of a woman during surgical treatments. So certainly I was very fortunate in that I had the most amazing professor, John McClure Brown, to whom I'm deeply grateful because he was extraordinary. He for reasons I've never was very clear, he had a massive international practice. People came from all over the world. They used to fly in to see him. And they would crowd in the operating theatre, and he would say to them, I don't know why you're watching me, why don't you go and see what Winston's doing in the lab? It's much more interesting. And so I was in on IVF at fairly early stages. Pre-implantation diagnosis is just a technique that you use to screen embryos for genetic diseases, and we were the first group to do that in the world, and it's become a modestly useful technique. I'm afraid it's been often misused as well, but basically it's been a useful technique for families that have lost children due to a serious genetic disease in the family. Well, when I got my grant from WHO in the early 70s, the predictions were that the world population would be 125 billion people. So predictions are wrong. One of the things I often say in talks is that scientists are no better at foretelling the future than anybody else. And now we expect that the world's population may grow to about 10 billion, maybe 11, but then all the evidence suggests it will then decline. And of course, population fluctuations are not due to contraception or due to reproductive medicine. Okay, we've created around 6 million IVF babies, but that against 6 billion individuals is absolutely trivial. What really controls population are living standards, hygiene, better water supplies, better education for women, better democracies. The predictions for Britain by Malthus in the 18th century was that we would be overpopulated by 1930 and there would be not enough food to support the population. What Malthus didn't know was that we were going to invent the water closet. The WC, of course, saved masses of lives, children's lives who no longer had contaminated water. So people didn't need to constantly breed, so that brought the population down. So that's nothing to do with medicine. That's to do with a whole lot of other things about the infrastructure of your society. And I'm very optimistic about the planet in the long term. I think that we will have a sustainable population, and I don't think that we will necessarily ravage the planet. The problems of climate change are there, but I don't think that will be so much related to populations. I think it may be due to what we've done already. No. I haven't. I mean, when I did my first television presenting, which was in the 1970s, 1978 was the first big series I did, Your Life in Their Hands, and I did 6 series of that. I had my director, John Mansfield, to whom I'm absolutely in debt. He would stand me in front of the camera and he'd say, Robert, I don't understand a word of it you're saying, you're completely unintelligible. Or, Robert, you're being pompous. And that's a fantastic education, hard to take, but doing a retake and actually then explaining it. And I think with science presentation, what I've tried to do is to only get out one idea with each piece of presentation, and I tend not to talk at great length to the camera. I mean, most of the things that I interpose on camera, unless it's a metaphor, would be less than 20 seconds. Remember when Tony Blair said education, education, education? I mean, I think that applies to small companies as well. I think that companies should be much more involved with public engagement. I think that we need to be much more involved with public engagement. The reason why I enjoy doing the sort of stuff that you're promoting is because I think that kind of public engagement is an important responsibility. It's a duty, actually, for scientists to be able to communicate what they're doing in simple terms without talking down to people, not condescending, not being patronizing, but explaining things as they are, to explain to them what they feel the problems might be. And I think that that's something which is essential for good academics to do. My first foray into the medium was in 1967 when I was doing a caesarean section in black and white television live. Well, it was being filmed. I think nobody had ever filmed a caesarean section before then. It was a very new thing to have a television camera in there. And I was doing this operation, and as I was delivering the baby with the camera behind me, filming down onto the abdomen, I'd open the abdomen, I would open the uterus, and I had those thespian instincts of showing off the baby being delivered, holding it and pulling it out of the uterus. And as I was pulling it out of the uterus, because I'm scrubbed up so I can't touch anything except the baby in the uterus, I had that horrible sensation which every surgeon dreads, which is the feeling of the pajama cord around my waist coming undone and my trousers slowly slipping down to my knees and then to my ankles. And the camera's behind me, and all I could think about as I was delivering that baby, did I put on clean knickers this morning? And, you know, ever since then I sort of was hooked on telly, really. And so I wrote a science fiction program in the 70s, which won an award, and then we did Your Life in Their Hands, and then I gave up television after 6 series almost completely. I did the news stuff, as IVF became very popular. Then, in fact, what happened was they did a fly-on-the-wall documentary about my work, a 7-part series called Making Babies, which was watched by, millions of people. Something like 15 million people, I think, watched because it was repeated. And that led to The Human Body, which, of course, won all those BAFTAs. Nothing to do with me. The production team were brilliant, of course, and it had a fantastic budget. But it was an example of how the BBC could do science really well. It was a wonderful team effort, produced by one of my best friends, Richard Dale, and we became very close. And then since then, for a long time, I was never short of doing a series. I did so many series for the BBC. Well, one thing I do quite a lot is to engage my audience, I use music a great deal. So I'm chairman of the Royal College of Music, which is a wonderful privilege. And I very often embed quite technical slides with musical examples, and the audience find that quite bizarre. I also use quite a lot of art in my speaking. So, for example, when I'm talking about eugenics, I often show 14th century, 15th century paintings. And I use a whole range of musical examples there, which may sound quite odd, but I try to look outside my subject. So I think my trick is to call on any aspect of being which is not directly related to the subject, but use that as a metaphor. And to my mind, that's a very powerful way of getting an audience really on side and waking them up, getting them interested. Where's he going? What's he doing? And that, I think, has been quite a successful strategy. I do it too with student audiences. When not for a speaking engagement, just when I'm teaching. And very often you think that you can sit and think, what the hell's he doing? Last week, for example, I talked to a group of finance administrators in a paid speaking engagement out of London. And I saw quite a lot of them bringing out their mobile phones and doing the usual thing that finance managers do because they want to see what the markets are doing. By the time I'd show my third slide, which was completely unexpected, they'd all put their mobile phones away, and they stayed away. And I felt, well, that use of parallel metaphors is valuable. The other thing which, of course, is really important is humour. Humour is, I think, really essential. I think far too many speakers take themselves very seriously and think that they can be absolutely didactic, that they've got the truth. I don't feel like that. I know that at some point I'm going to fall flat on my face. But I also think that if I am enjoying the audience, they might be enjoying what I'm saying. And so whenever I'm speaking, I'm listening to my audience, really listening to them, even though they're not saying anything. I'm very, very conscious of what they're doing, what they seem to be thinking in their faces. I don't like to speak to an audience in the complete dark in the theatre. I like to have the house lights on, for example. And I think that aspect of communication for me is something I learned way back in the theatre. I think the greatest medical breakthrough is probably going to be understanding how the environment influences our health more. I think that's where it's really needed. And I don't just mean pollution, I mean much more complicated. For example, the epidemic of obesity is not just fizzy drinks. I mean, I love Jamie Oliver. He's a wonderful person, and I admire him, altruistic and public-spirited, but actually it's so much more complicated than what you eat. You know, what we now know is, for example, a great-grandparent with a particular diet can influence great-grandchildren while the in-between generations are not affected. It's very, very interesting. That is this science of epigenetics. So I think that in the immediate future, we're going to be involved with that more and more. I'm currently involved with a big project in Singapore where we're looking at follow-up on the effect of the environment on children, about 2,500 children. We've been following them since their conception. I mean, how do we know when they're conceived? Well, it's interesting, but it's amazing how close to conception you can get with a carefully run study. These children are about 6, and we can see all sorts of environmental influences which have been completely unknown. The bacteria in their gut, for example, are an environmental influence which changes a whole range of things from the way they think to the kind of disease risks they have. I don't just mean infections, I mean diabetes, for example. Well, I think actually, if I'm really honest, it sounds really cheesy, actually, but it shouldn't do. My children, I've got 3 kids, 5 grandchildren, 1 on the way. My 3 children are funny, responsible, thoughtful, very politically aware, not necessarily belonging to a party, but very aware of society. Good at what they do. I mean, I've got one son who's a better scientist than I am, and one guy who's making a name in broadcasting in a way that I never have done. He's in Los Angeles. I feel very happy with that. I think achievements in science are much less important than people imagine. You know, even if you win a Nobel Prize, for example, in 5 years' time, you're 8-point type at the bottom of a page, and, you know, nobody remembers who was the Nobel Prize winner for medicine 5 years ago. Why should they? Because time moves on. But the next generation is something that we can all nurture. And I suppose if I have one message to audiences, it's that actually we neglect the next generation at our peril.